Welcome back, Juli and Francie. We are so glad to have you back this week. Last week, we had an incredible episode talking about marriage and our role as wives, and it was so rich and important. And we talked a lot about perspective and how we have a choice in how we respond and how we react and how we choose to think about what's happening in our homes. So thank you for that. And this week we are touching on intimacy. So let's start where we did in the last episode. Let's go back to basics. What is the role of intimacy in marriage? Francie, why don't we start with you this week?
Well, it's a big question. And I think it's one that in the church, we've had a very simplistic answer to that hasn't served us well. And I think if we look at our old way of thinking, which was probably goes way back to early church history, that really does a disservice in terms of separating the body from the spirit, saying the spirit's good and the body's bad. We've had a thought that sex is just a necessity. It's just do it to procreate, just do it because we got to do it. It's a need. And then it follows through all these years of church history, taking different forms. And then we have the purity culture, honestly, in our most recent history that we all have felt that says, well, sex is only for marriage. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And then the marriage books mostly just say, the old marriage books, not Juli's, but the old marriage books would say sex is a man's need. And so I think that those are some of the narratives that play in our mind of sex as a man's need, a wife's duty. And if you're in the world, it's more of a sex is all for my self-gratification. But the truth is, married sex is a completely different story according to God's design. And it is pretty much the best news ever that we have not heard that God is inviting us to re-see with new eyes. And it's the invitation to see his fingerprints all over us, head to toe, that he made us. Psalm 139 type made us. He made us wonderfully and fearfully for the purpose of knowing him more. Our whole body is designed as an image-bearing glory, and that includes our sexuality and the gift of married sex. So when we talk about married sex and what is it good for? What does it mean? It is this beautiful gift from God that two become one. And when a husband and a wife engage in intimacy and have sex, there is a narrative being displayed that God designed us to be intimately connected to love. And that story is revealed in married sex. There's a whole lot more to it, but I think that the purity culture stopped too soon to say, just don't do it. And they forgot to give us this beautiful Genesis to Revelation worldview that our bodies have meaning, our sexuality has meaning, and married sex has meaning. And not only meaning, but power to do things in our home to bring forth healing and oneness and the goodness of God in a marriage. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, but that's kind of the big picture vision.
Juli, what would you say?
Boy, Francie, you just so beautifully articulated that. I just want to sit in that for a while. God has just given you beautiful words to articulate the beauty of what he's created. And like you said, it's so much more complex than most of us realize. It's a multifaceted diamond, if you will. And there are different seasons where different facets of that gift show themselves. So absolutely, there's the beauty of the passion and of the pleasure that a couple experiences, the connection, even biochemically, the role of hormones and neurotransmitters that make us feel close to one another. But I think some of the aspects of sex that we often don't talk about is how it's a celebration, even a cementing of our covenant promise, that sex can be like a sacrament. It's a physical way that we regularly do something to remember a spiritual truth. So in the same way that Jesus would say, take communion as a way of remembering that you belong to me and remembering that I've laid down my life for you, the scripture would say a husband and wife give each other your bodies as a physical way of remembering that you've given your lives to one another, remembering that covenant. So that means in good times and bad. It means when sex isn't necessarily fun or pleasurable, there's still this, hey, let's remember what we've promised, even with our bodies. Sex is also this journey of intimate knowing. And when I work with couples who are experiencing great difficulty with their sexual relationship, and there are many couples that are in that category, they're saying, sex isn't fun. It's not pleasurable right now. It creates conflict. So what's the purpose? And I would say to them, the purpose is that God has given you a very tangible area of your marriage to work on, where you're called to know each other at the deepest levels, to be free to talk about the things that evoke shame in your heart, to be compelled to forgive each other and to show empathy and mercy. And so I think we talk so much about sex should be fun and pleasurable. And yes, it should be. But when it's not, recognizing that there's still something very substantial happening, and it's still a very powerful and great gift that couples need to grapple with.
I feel like that's going to be a new idea for people and something that maybe they haven't thought of before. When you compared it to like the sacrament, that is just a really interesting comparison. And it reminds us of that covenant. And Francie, in last week's episode, you gave an example of when you didn't feel like having sex with your husband, but yet you did that as an avenue for unity. Because most of us think we have to feel like having sex to do it in our marriage. Like if we're angry, we're in a fight. Well, that's not what we do. And so can you speak a little bit, and maybe Francie, we'll start with you, on how you overcome that? We can be hurt and have an open spirit, or we can be hurt and have a closed spirit. And so what I heard in that story is that you were hurt by, or maybe angry or whatever, but you still had an open spirit. So how do we kind of cross that hurdle?
So I think what it requires is a worldview shift, a sex view shift is what I call it, because we all have a worldview, but we also have a sex view. And we have to understand that we're seeing sex through a certain lens. And I talk about, there's 5 W's that I've noticed. We're either seeing it through the world's lens, through the whispers of the church ladies, which you know what I mean by that, like maybe it's shameful or a burden or a drag, or we see it through the lens of our wounds, which is real and needs definite care and tenderness and counseling and healing. And God is the God of healing. Or we see it through our weariness. Oh, I'm just so tired. I don't want to do it. It's just a chore. Or we can see it through the word of God. And one framework that I've thought of is that within those W's, we see 2 extremes. There's the prudish stream on one side, and then there's the crude on one side. And usually at church, people fall into the prude side, where they see sex as more of related to shame-based or related to the church's poor framing of it, or we're afraid of the crude. But there is a completely third way, which is based on the word of God, that 5th W, and it's redeemed sexuality. And it is redeemed sex, which sex is not about self-gratification. It's not about self at all. It's about oneness. And it's about battling for oneness, because where there's oneness, there can be fruitfulness. We see that throughout the whole Bible, is that oneness leads to fruitfulness. And it's even in the analogy with Christ and us. When we are one with him, when we're connected in love with Jesus, what do? We bear fruit. And so in the garden, God's dream for sexuality was not about one person getting their needs met. It was about fruitfulness and unity leading to fruitfulness. And so all that saying, I began thinking differently when I saw, when we choose connection and unity, there is more fruit in our lives. It doesn't matter if I'm feeling romantic, or if the candles are lit, or if we've had the best date ever. We choose connection because we were made to have a fruitful marriage. And that is what makes us alive as humans on the earth, is fruitfulness and love bringing fruitfulness. And so I used to believe that if I had the emotional feelings, then my body would be more open to sex. I would want sex. But if I didn't want sex. But now I realize I want sex because it was God's good idea for unity, because I want unity in my marriage and I want connection. And so it doesn't matter as much the atmosphere of my emotions in that moment if I have a right vision of what sex is about. And so I think that was a big change for me, is to see that sex can be about a completely different thing than this crude idea or this prude idea, that it was one of God's gifts for unity that can bless a marriage with all of those hormones and the chemicals and everything that does bring bonding, that there is a reality there that I want for my marriage. And so I think that helped me switch my mindset a little bit. And I actually experienced it before I understood it. But it was by leaning in and choosing connection that I saw a shift in our marriage, that sex is a gift from God for every season.
And I will testify that when Francie first explained this to me, that was probably 6 or 7 years ago. I came home and told my husband, it's like, Francie says, if we have more sex, then we will be more fruitful in other areas of our lives. And it just kind of blew my mind. But it really was a mindset shift that impacted my heart right away. Because instead of this idea of almost like banks, like I have banked this amount of energy to give to you, or this amount of times that I'm going to do you this favor, or whatever kind of finite element that I felt like I was giving over, it was much more about opening up to how God created us and that it was going to multiply. And that my motivation to send my husband out into the world well equipped, I realized that our sex life impacted that, not just the words I speak over him or how I pray for him, but how I connect with him physically is going to impact how he is prepared to go out into the world. And I'm motivated by that, even when I'm not motivated by, like, he's kind of annoying me, or I'm not motivated by the feeling of the moment. I am motivated by the greater mission. And Francie, you changed my life. And of course, Krista and I always joke about how our husbands love Francie because.
Oh yeah. They're like, please invite Francie to every retreat and every event you ever do, please.
So I do think, as Krista said, that these ideas may be new for our listeners, but I want to encourage you to not just turn the podcast off and not consider it again. Really pray through this idea that God created something that has a larger mission, and that when we come together, it is a beautiful micro evidence of God's macro story, which we talked about last week, of kind of, here our marriages, our little marriages are playing out God's bigger story.
Juli, would you add anything to that?
Yeah. I think some of the practical that I might add to that is, first of all, about 50% of women would say that they experience more of what we call receptive sexual desire instead of an initiating sexual desire. So for a lot of women, in the scenario that, like Francie would say, your mind isn't on sex, it's not what you're thinking about. But once you begin getting involved in the process of sexuality and thinking about being with your husband and experiencing that, you're like, hey, yeah, I could do this. Like, this is actually fun. And so I think it's really important for women to understand that God has designed us, many of us, in a way where it's not that we're going to be thinking about sex as often as our husband does, but we have to engage with it before we even start to experience desire. So that would be one thing I'd say. Another thing I'd say that maybe is a little bit of a caveat. I don't want women to walk away from this conversation hearing, in order to be fruitful, you have to have sex with your husband all the time. And the reason I say that is because, again, my view is sort of flavored by the work that I do, but there are so many women who will say, sex is physically painful for me, which it was for me for about a decade of our marriage. Or they'll say sex is triggering because of abuse that I suffered, or they're working through something like a husband's pornography addiction. And the answer isn't give your husband sex. I don't want you to hear that. What Francie is really saying, the bigger picture is start working towards intimacy. And for some couples, that means we need to begin addressing the barriers that have been there for a long time that we never talk about. And I think when you just hear sex is going to fix it, it's not. If there is emotional pain, if there's physical pain, if there's relational brokenness that hasn't been addressed, the physical part will even in some cases make it worse. The call is, how do we address the barriers so that we really can start becoming one and actually enjoying the gift that God has given? And for some couples, that's going to be a journey of years. It doesn't happen right away.
Yes.
So good.
Thank you for saying that, Juli.
Yeah.
I would love to hear a little more about that, because I think, Juli, I guess I'm going to go back to you on this. And that is, half of the marriages that exist right now, and maybe more, are caught in that space of pornography addiction. The statistics are just there. We can't deny them. They're there. And I think a lot of people are feeling hopeless in trying to overcome this with either, or maybe they're doing it within their marriage. Can you speak to a little bit of just where do people start in that process that you said? I mean, how do they start talking about those things and start even rewiring their brains in that way?
Yeah. So I guess to give context to this, if we go back to the idea that sexuality and marriage are meant to be a reflection of Christ in the church, it's this covenant relationship, and a covenant is based on faithfulness. It's based on character and promise. If we couldn't trust God to do what he said he would do for us, we would have no relationship with him. Every other aspect of sexuality is built out of the foundation of trust. So the ability to let go and have fun, the ability to experience orgasm, the ability to be deeply known and share my shame with my husband and my fears and my passions. If trust isn't there, we can't do any of that. And what a lot of people have learned growing up is that sex is actually more about the experience of immediate pleasure than it is about all these other elements. They've learned about sex through pornography. And pornography says sex is about what I can consume, about my sexual high, about chasing the next thing, which erodes all trust in a relationship and in a sexual relationship in particular. So you really can't move forward until you address that. And so women that hear the message, just give your husband lots of sex and he'll stop looking at pornography. That is so not true. It's two separate things. One is an addiction to experience a sexual high. The other one is living out a commitment to a person. And so if you're in that situation, my advice to you would be, you need to create a crisis. You need to say, this is not okay. Whether it's your issue with pornography, and there are a lot of women who struggle with it, or it's your husband, or it's yours as a couple, you have to say, this is destroying us and we can't move forward. And I want to give you hope. Like, I was just talking to a couple the other day who 3 years ago, I first met them at a speaking event. And at the time they were separated. They were a Christian couple who had agreed to have an open sexual relationship from the start. So they both had sexual partners. They both had sexual addictions. And the woman, she was at the point of being suicidal. Her heart had been so destroyed through this. And they really recommitted their life to Christ. They committed to the journey of healing through counseling, through groups, through their individual work addressing the sexual addictions. And this couple is just thriving now. They just beam when they talk about what God has done in their marriage, in their sexual relationship. So I want to tell you that there is hope. I know so many couples who have overcome this, but it's not a side hobby to overcome a sexual addiction. It's a spiritual battle, and it really takes your commitment, and it takes saying we can't move forward until this is addressed.
I like that you said create a crisis,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's become so normalized that a lot of people just say, well, it's just pornography. It's just, or whatever, fill in the blank, because it's become so normal. I mean, I just heard a story the other day of a woman locally who was at a game, and there was a whole bunch of kids around a phone at the concession stand. And she peeked over into the middle of the group, and it was a video, hard porn being played, that all of these kids at a concession stand at a game at the school. And it's become so normal that kids are, growing up with this idea that this is normal. We can do this at a concession stand. And so that is really interesting for you to say, create a crisis. I appreciate that. Francie, do you have anything to add?
Honestly, I just appreciate Juli's experience and wisdom. I think if anybody has any more questions, they should check out her podcast, because she has so many scenarios that we wonder, what about me in this scenario? And she's addressed so many hope-filled situations that are real and don't feel hope-filled at the moment, but that can be. And I think not being afraid to get a counselor, not being afraid to ask for help, not being afraid to say, hey, I want more and I don't know where to start, and asking someone that you trust, do you know of a counselor? Because I think some of us think we have to do it alone, and that's a lie. We don't have to do it alone, and there is help and there is potential to find overcoming and healing, and lots of people have.
Francie, I want to shift a little bit to something that you told me once, and that is that you and Wyatt, your husband, would go to the library and do some research and make it a date night. And so I think it gets to this question of, as women, how do we kind of guide this aspect of our marriage, and what are maybe even some creative ways to do that? And that has stuck with me because I thought that was really creative.
In terms of growing your sex life.
Yeah. And just making it fun and making it something you do together, almost in partnership. I mean, that even like to go to a bookstore or a library, I mean, that was a new idea to me at the time.
Well, that was in the days of Borders and Barnes and Noble. And I was so prudish. I was on the prude side that I would get another book and put it on the outside because I did not want anybody to see that I was reading a sex book or marriage book. There are lots of marriage books. Juli has written one that's amazing about sex. There's a recent one that Gary Thomas has come out that's a really good one called Married Sex. There's lots of resources. I think you could even just say, hey, babe, I got a sex book. Let's read it together. Let's have fun. I think the problem that I'm seeing in the library of sex books these days is there's just so much confusion in literature. If you're out of Christian sections, so if you want to get like a biology, how the clitoris works types book, go to like the 1980s book section, find books that were written in the 80s, because they have biology, but they're not so deep with confusion and chaos and twisted sexuality. When we do look for sex books, we look for ones that don't have images, they don't have pictures, and you do have to weed through some stuff when you're looking for like, how does my body work? But I think that's part of our problem, is that we don't have enough conversations in the church of, how do you have an orgasm? How does my body work? When I got married, Wyatt would ask me questions about my period, and I say, I actually have no idea. I have no idea about anything down there, because it was this completely, like we talked about, spirit good, body bad. Nobody said my body was bad, but the silence told me my body was bad. And so because nobody talked to me about it, and nobody really helped guide my growing femininity, I really actually had a disdain for my body. So I think my growth in sexuality was pretty stunted because I was so disconnected from the goodness of my body. On a practical level, one fun thing that I think a wife could do, and I did this not out of being fun, but out of needing healing, was my first year of marriage, we'd lay in bed and I'd just say, Wyatt, I need you to tell me what you love about my body. And he was delighted to do that, but I desperately needed to hear it, because I needed to rewire my neural pathways, because I had heard your body covered up, covered up, covered up. I know Juli has a recent podcast about how you see your body, your feminine body, either it's too much or not enough. And having him bless my body by saying, I love this curve, I love this bit. And it was not even all sexual. It was just him honoring my body, helped me grow to show up in my body without shame. And I think, to echo what Juli said, it is all about trust. And that is what sex requires, is vulnerability. You cannot have great sex without trust and vulnerability. That's why, like, Tinder culture will never have good sex. The world will never have great sex because it doesn't have trust. And so I think any exercises you can do to grow in trust of vulnerability, and knowing great sex requires vulnerability, and that exposes hard places and weakness. But when you lean into healing, you lean into the God, the healer, counseling, then you can build trust some more. You'll find more vulnerability, more hard things, more joy. And it's this growing, healing journey that you don't ever really arrive, but you just keep growing. And so I think having a curiosity, having lightheartedness about it, knowing that our bodies are fun and we can giggle and we can laugh, and you probably will, if you're enjoying each other, you're going to laugh, because it's kind of, there's awkward moments, there's fun moments, there's pleasure-filled moments, and that's all part of it. But having a learning heart, knowing that God created our bodies amazingly, and we probably will never get to the end of how awesome and wonderful he made us, because we are wonderfully made. It can be a growth experiment.
I was just thinking how vulnerable that would actually feel for so many to say to their husband and ask him that. And so I like that you said after that, find ways to build trust, because maybe you need to build up to that. Like maybe that would be too much right now because you maybe a couple just isn't at that place. But if you start building that trust, it's like a muscle. It gets stronger and stronger till you do get to that space. Juli, what would you say?
Yeah, as Francie was talking again, going back to that trust, one of the things that has really been solidified to me is, just the idea that the most important characteristic of a great sex life is character. We think it's the perfect body. It's having all this information on how to have a great sex life. It's character, because if you don't have the character, like for me to be able to trust my husband to say, tell me how you see my body. Man, there are a lot of women who would fear that, not just because of their own baggage, but because their husbands have said things that are hurtful. We all the time get emails, I'm not attracted to my wife anymore. What do I do? Or I'm not attracted to my husband anymore. What do I do? The key is sex isn't about being attracted. You actually become attracted because of what you choose to focus on. And so there's so much unlearning that has to happen with even the average Christian married couple, that until you get this right framework of sex, it's really hard to grow out of a faulty foundation.
That was a mic drop. That was a mic drop moment right there, Juli. It was. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, well, and there are some great Christian resources that have been created. I love Cliff and Joyce Penner's stuff. They do a good job of talking about the biology from a Christian perspective. Doug Rosenau's book, A Celebration of Sex, is a great resource that my husband and I use. It's somewhere always by our bedside. And so there are really good resources. Francie's referencing a book that I actually just finished. It'll come out in June, but it really does talk about building the right foundation of how we think about sex as a married couple, because so many of us are working from the wrong understanding of what actually makes a great sex life. And then all the help in the world doesn't help us because we don't know how to think rightly about our sexuality.
Wow. And if we don't know how to think right about our sexuality, how are we supposed to pass on to our children? I mean, we don't. I mean, that's the reality, is that we don't. And so I really appreciate that. But I can just see that a lot of people, or I'm imagining a lot of women who are feeling a little bit discouraged at this moment and thinking, wow, here I am at this age, and I'm just hearing this stuff for the first time. And I have done this really wrong in my marriage. What would you say to that woman who's feeling that way?
Well, let me first say I was there. So I had every advantage you could imagine. Grew up in a Christian home, all these degrees in psychology, was in full-time Christian ministry. And it really has only been over the last maybe 12 to 15 years that I've really started to uncover how I was thinking wrong about sex, and frankly, how I was taught wrongly about sex from the Christian culture. God is a God of redeeming, and every aspect of his perfect creation has been touched by the fall. It's been touched by our sinful natures, but he's in the business of redeeming. So let it be hope for you that I don't have to stay stuck where I am today, that God desires, he longs to redeem this part of our lives. We just honestly never invite him in. It's almost like we have this do not enter sign. Like even when we do our Bible study, we don't apply the truths of scripture to our sex lives. And when we start doing that, we truly see transformation.
Francie, what would you say?
I love to, I guess, speak from my experience in the last few years, realizing that even after pursuing this sexual worldview transformation, I still could feel the tug of shame in my perspective of my body, of really entering in and receiving freely, and this divided mind that I would struggle with in sex. And one of the things that has deeply touched my heart was this invitation God gave me to bless my body. And so I think this might even be a more private place between you and God, that our sex life, as Juli likes to say, is indicative of our spiritual life, and that the two are not very far apart at all. In fact, often are revealing of each other. And so when I have sexual shame, I realize I need to go to my Creator on my own and say, God, would you touch my heart just between you and me? Would you reveal to me how well you made me, and that I don't have to be stuck in the shame of my past or the shame of Christian culture that's been confusing for me. And so what it looks like for me is literally beginning with baby steps. I remember I heard a speaker say, you can bless your body. You can stand, in front of the mirror naked and bless your body and thank God for it. And I thought, I will never do that. That is so uncomfortable. And so I did not. And I started with just my eyes closed on my shoulders. God, thank you for my strong shoulders, that they can hold up my baby bag, that they can drive the car with all my kids in it. And I started realizing my body is a gift. And my body is good. And then slowly, as the years went by, I began to realize that I can get in touch with my feminine body and say, thank you, God, that my body is good, and that my body head to toe is good. And so it became this conversation just between me and the Lord, that how he made me is beautiful, no matter what the culture says, no matter what anybody else says. And I think as I found more freedom and more healing with my maker and more peace with my body and my femininity, I could then be loved in a more whole way in my marriage and offer myself. And so I think body blessings have become a real special place between me and my God, because he's the one who sees me and knows me and created me to be naked and unashamed. And the enemy's trying always to make me naked and full of shame. And so I choose to step into that place of healing. And it is one day at a time, one season at a time. A new place opens up, and saying, God, if that opens up and it feels sore, I invite you in. Instead of closing it off and shutting down, I invite you into that place, God. And it might not even be a work that your husband knows about at this point, but it's between you and your God. And eventually it will, like that seed, it will grow into something bigger and more beautiful in your marriage.
Wow. Okay. That is just a great charge. That is, it's going to be hard for some people, but I think what a great exercise. And that's good. This is all so good. I mean, you both have incredible podcasts that we will link to in the show notes. We will point people to, because people just need more of you. They need more of your perspective and who you are. Thank you both so much for the work that you do. It really is holy work that you are doing in the most profound way. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for giving us a chance to share and to share together. What a treat.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Dream team right here. We're wanting a repeat of this at some point. All right. Bye, Francie and Juli. Thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Bye.